I loved Bioware games. I loved Mass Effect, I loved Dragon Age, I loved Baldur's Gate, and I loved Knights of the Old Republic. They were my first RPGs that I really invested my time into. They were the first games that managed to invoke emotions out of me that no other game had ever achieved. I finished Dragon Age Origins a handful of times, and Mass Effect 1 and 2 probably another 4 or 5 times. I loved how these games were able to produce compelling characters with actual personalities and layers that made me care about them, that made me remember their name, that made me want to spend time with them and learn more about them. I loved their stories, and I loved my own story and choices told alongside them. Bioware for the past years lost a lot of my support, along with many others that shared the same love for the company and for the games they created, to a fault due to their evil masters, EA, bringing subpar titles like Mass Effect Andromeda, Dragon Age 2, and not forget the disaster that was Mass Effect 3 ending. Anthem got a lot riding on its shoulders. It's been hyped for years. An entirely new IP set in a looter-shooter genre and not an RPG, as Bioware came to be known ever since its inception, but one that would still carry the torch, if you will, of Bioware games. So it was sad. This makes Anthem not just another looter-shooter, it was a new Bioware title. So does it deliver? Well, in short, it does some things right, but also does many fundamentally wrong things. I have much to discuss, as you probably saw from the length of this video, and the first topic I want to talk about is story, characters and choices, and how that connects with the gameplay, as that is what most people and I expect coming out of Bioware. The story and the world building here is vast, quite deep as well. It isn't a new IP with just a small localized story. No, a world and universe exists in Anthem. The world's story has problems and one big underlying issue. For one, the lore feels overly convoluted. As I said, the story can go quite deep, from world-building energies, the Anthem, and big ancient civilizations that use it to build and reshape worlds. The Shapers, if misused, can cause cataclysms, world-reshaping events that can turn a city into ash. This is where we as a player come in. We take on a role of a freelancer with a pretty badass entry, as a cataclysm is currently underway the minute we enter in the game. It is our role to protect humanity by using these badass mech suits called javelins. All of this sounds pretty cool and quite badass as well, but all of this information and story is sometimes poorly told throughout the game. For one, it immediately throws you in and starts talking about all these events, technologies and energies and places that you have no clue what they are unless you go into the game's codexes to try truly grasp them. Sure, characters talk about the Anthem, they talk about the Shapers or other events, but at the start of the game I couldn't help but feel confused by almost everything. It didn't ease you into the world and story like other games in the past, but throw you in and shower you with all this information that will take you a good amount of reading and playtime to finally understand it all. But even now, after 40 plus hours and after finishing the main story, I still don't really get what the Anthem really is. Is it like the Force? Is it a life and world creating magic of sorts? Is it some sort of space matter that is capable of opening these wormholes or black holes and just warp things? Is that how most enemies in the game appear? Is that even Anthem or other type of energy? Is it all of the above? There are all these questions surrounding many aspects in the game and story, but they are not really answered. Then we have the actual main story of the game, which throughout all of it is incredibly difficult to follow, and like I said, there is a pretty nice start to it, but after that it just slows down and not much happens. Luckily, a few hours into it, it picks back up and can get quite interesting, and there's actually decent characters, at least on our main team, like Owen, our Robin to our Batman, Halleck, and Faye. These were generally good characters, albeit with some cliche arcs, but they were still memorable and made the overall story all the better. Are they a Morrigan or any of the Mass Effect characters? Well, no, but decent. The game also employs amazing cutscene, voice acting with some bad ones here or there, and motion capture work. The facial animations put Mass Effect Andromeda to shame. This does add to the game, making it feel more real and in turn immersive whenever any cutscene plays out, especially since they are made in first person, although not all.
Commander!
What is going on here?
Keeping the streets safe, sir. Notice this undesirable entering the premises. Stole that citizen's bag.
That is not your job. You file reports at your desk. You... It's no matter. Your family has ordered you home.
To Anthem?
Immediately.
Beautiful.
Come with me. Now!
I'll contact your cipher. We'll set up a meet, explain everything, okay?
However, the villain, the Monitor, and the Dominion, which is looking to exploit the Anthem, does come out extremely flat as well. You see him 3 or 4 times and he sounds intimidating and threatening. He sounds and looks cool, but leads to nowhere. You don't really learn his motivations outside of wanting to be powerful and insert cliché villain motives, and towards the end of the main missions, which were not very long, I might add, about 8 hours or so, he was just disposable. It just finishes. One moment he's there and there's all these threats going on, and then it's just over, leaving you to say, is that it, as the credits roll out.
A pity for you. Negotiations have concluded.
Granted, they tease you after of what's to come and seems interesting, but I couldn't help but feel a lot of the story was missing, with gaps left unfilled and, well, unpolished. But here comes the biggest issue with the main story, and is the way it's told outside of the great cutscenes and actual dialogue: the missions. The mission structure and variety is practically null. There is about 2 or 3 types of mission types in the game. Go to an area, kill a wave of enemies. Go to an area, defend it, kill a wave of enemies. Go to an area, kill a wave of enemies. Pick up orbs or some other object to progress further, kill a wave of enemies. There are also some puzzles, but these were restricted to specific side missions and they were nothing to write home about, but still this small variation was appreciated. But the problem with all of this is that it makes the missions extremely repetitive. Now, the combat does carry it really does, and I will get there in a minute, but the story suffers heavily because of this. Due to one, a lot of the story is done as you do the mission, by radio talk, which is one of the least compelling and immersive ways of telling a story, especially coming from Bioware. When that's happening, I'm way too busy shooting, burning, freezing everything in sight. I don't care what you're saying at that point. I'm way too distracted by the gameplay, by the combat, or just flying. 2. These small bits of storytelling are triggered by mission phases, like certain spots during the mission. Well, this is primarily a co-op game, with squads of 4 people, and more often than not, if someone is ahead of you, is gonna trigger all this dialogue of how you rescued someone, but you were not even there, your mate was. So you didn't even saw anything happening, or a voice line was skipped because a guy rushed ahead, or you stayed a bit behind from them and the game's aggressive tethering system forces you into a loading screen. We'll come back to that later, surely. You can play solo to avoid some of these issues, but it's just tedious and overly difficult. Just don't. The game was really not designed to play solo. And 3rd, no matter how you dress up the mission, all still felt similar from each other. So on one hand, you have this pretty interesting conversations going on at the hub or a cutscene, and then when you actually get to play it out, it's pretty much the same thing you did 10 times already in terms of gameplay. So all of this combined sours a lot of the storytelling. It breaks your immersion. It makes you care less about it, and that's not necessarily the writing fault or the story fault. It's just the means the story is being told, because in the end this is not an RPG, this is a looter shooter, so it feels like there wasn't a place where a story could be told in a meaningful and well-crafted way, as Bioware is known for. Don't get me wrong, there are amazing missions and there are some interesting moments on the main campaign, but these are far in between, and most of what you do in the actual gameplay feels the same as everything else, and that feels disconnected from the story being told. Another area where this can be seen is in the hub and general side stories. There's a lot of people to talk about in the hub. Some will provide the side missions, which are as extensive as the main story, or contracts, which will follow a similar pattern. I will touch on all of that in a moment. But the people that you can talk on the hub also comes out flat. They are generally interesting, not as compelling as the people from the main story, far from it. I don't remember any of their names, even after spending a long while listening to them, but a lot of them had interesting little stories or fun little things, like this guy which really wants to be your friend and tells gossips of other characters.
It's probably not.
I hope it is. Okay, true or false? At Princess Zim's caravan, did you eat Korok's testicles?
False.
Oh no, this is not good.
Why does this disappoint you?
I made a sizable wager you did. This is gonna cost me.
Now, these little stories progress as you go through the game, but it feels that they just happen with minimal involvement from you. Like, for an example, there was this merchant that wanted help in building this sustainable farm inside the fort. It was a nice little side story, right? And you do have a choice in what you say. Well, two choices. So can you offer her money in order for her to achieve her dream, or go on a side mission to help her somehow? No, nothing really happens besides later on you talk to some other character and they eventually make a deal. But you don't really feel like it was your doing. You just feel like an errand boy or just a listener throughout this world in the hub, going from character to character with this really slow movement through these very tight corridors, albeit you can sprint now. Don't get me wrong, the stories were interesting to hear and endearing. It just again feels disconnected from the rest of the game. What you say generally doesn't matter that much, and there's only the illusion of choice, with no real consequences in the game itself when it comes to the characters. It feels like they were written for a typical Bioware RPG game, but then they realized, oh yeah, this is a looter shooter, where we play as this badass javelins that kills hordes of enemies. We cannot really have this here, but we are Bioware, so we have to. Another thing that triggered me is characters say constantly, let's go do this thing, like at the bar, let's have a drink. And our character says, sure. But again, nothing happens. These little off-the-beaten path quests or little events or moments would add charm to the game, would serve as these breaks from all the fighting, and would have made the hub a more fun and compelling place to be in, and set it apart from just being a looter shooter even more so than actually having a story. But it just feels like a missed opportunity, and in turn just pulls you constantly out of the game, and honestly disappoints you. Speaking of which, the hub. It's really beautiful, but in the end it proves to be a 10 out of 10 girl or guy, but with a very lacking personality. Eventually, you will just get bored of it. So besides talking to all these different characters, you can pick up codex items, select your missions and the forge to edit to your loadout. That's it. There's vendors, but they are useless because they aren't vendors. They're just a way for you to access the microtransactions stored in game. You don't need them. What they offer you can access far quicker by just clicking the escape key. So outside of talking to characters and slightly changing over time as you progress through the game, like opening up a new area, getting more people in, it feels like an interactive menu. The store, by the way, is nothing to be really concerned about. It offers only cosmetic options on these timely cycles, and all can be purchased for in-game money, and its earnings are quite generous. I finished the game with more than 100k. That was almost enough to buy 2 full armor sets from the store. Hopefully it stays this way, even though on a personal level I'm not a fan of microtransactions in a fully priced title. Now there's also the launch bay, part of the hub, behind the loading screen, where you can actually see people. But I don't get how a multiplayer focused game has almost zero social interaction or features. Well, for one, to enter the launch bay you need to matchmake, weirdly, and it's only about 6 people or so in there at a time. And you can do everything here that you can do in the hub: inventory, forage, go on missions and see the people. But you can't talk to them. There's no chat. There's no nothing. You can emote and you can inspect them, but you cannot talk to people in a multiplayer game. Why? It's a multiplayer game. Multiplayer online game. There's nothing when it comes to interacting with people, not even a kicking system when someone is trolling. This not only makes going to the launch bay almost pointless, but makes missions annoying sometimes. Like once, I stayed dead for a good amount of time, and I couldn't tell my squad like, hey, I'm dead, can I get a rest? Nope. Or when one time the mission bugged and I wanted to tell my squad, let's just die and reset it. Nope. Luckily, we were in sync and we did it anyway, but a chat is the absolute basic thing in any online game. Players in this game might as well be NPCs. They don't feel as players. The only thing that makes you realize they are actually players and real people is that they can use emotes. That's it, and they have weird names. Now granted, the launch bay was placed in the game due to player feedback, and Bioware seems to be listening to a lot of feedback, and that does need to be praised.
The path comes to an end for you here, as it did for our general, as it does for us all. Your inevitable death awaits you, Lancer. Go forth to face it.
To cleanse our palate a little bit, let's talk about the game's combat. The combat is actually the most fun I had in a third-person shooter game in quite a while. So here we have our Javelin, this pretty cool looking mech, except for its dreadful chicken legs. There's 4 types: Colossus, Ranger, Storm, and an Interceptor, all with different abilities, gear, and sometimes even weapons. I went for the Colossus, which is the beefy boy, a quite tanky but slow javelin. You can play all of them as you level, but you will need to get all their different gear, as it can be unique, so changing javelins is not that viable unless you spend a lot of time playing. Now this is a looter shooter, so you can expect spending a lot of time shooting, but it does pull some twists, like being able to fly. Flying is amazing, and the controls on the PC were finally fixed, and I would say it's perfect now to fly or swim your javelin around, and this world is stunning to fly around. It feels massive with big drops, waterfalls, giant mountains, giant ancient ruins and ships. No one's gonna deny that the graphics and aesthetics of this world is bad. It is beautiful and a huge amount of fun to fly around. You can go up high, you can dive in and go underwater, so there's a great sense of freedom when it comes to flying. And in general, you just feel like a goddamn Iron Man. Flying also employs an overheating mechanic. Some might argue is way too short, and sometimes it is, but makes interesting uses of water and diving in order to counteract the overheating. Like diving down allows it to cool the engines. Flying close to water or when it's raining makes it cooled, either slowing the overheating process or stopping it altogether, depending how close you are. On the opposite spectrum, fire, like fire using enemies, can overheat it instantly, making you unable to fly and escape. So when the environment works in your favor, you're not just flying to go to a mission objective, it is part of the gameplay. You're trying to get close to water, you're trying to find a location to dive and control the overheating, so it turns into an almost mini game and well makes flying even more engaging and fun, like diving down deep in a lake to cool your engine then fly back up. And the graphics and the sound effects of all of that, it just never got old for me and it just felt cool and badass. That said, when there's no water and no place to dive in, It can be extremely frustrating as you're trying to get where you want to, and you're left with sprinting on the ground, but when it works rather well. So when you mix this, the ability, the freedom to go anywhere you want, reposition, run away, or just hover over your enemies, makes the combat all the better and stand apart from other looter shooters. The shooting is also fun. Weapons feel good with a nice impact and sound effects. There's also a nice amount of them, from assault rifles to exploding sniper rifles. Don't ask. But why are they all the same aesthetically? There is about 3 types of each weapon category, like 3 types of autocannons, which is the unique weapon to the Colossus, but they all look the same, with just recolors. Mechanically, they are a bit different, but it doesn't matter if it's common or epic, they look the same. I actually didn't notice this till later in the game, that there is only one look to each weapon type or category. It just feels awfully disappointing. The same follows for armor customization. Again, aesthetically, there's about 3 or 4 pieces. One that you came with, one rare type that you can buy with coins, another one that you can buy with coins or on the cash shop, and one that came with a game's special edition. That's it. My Javelin pretty much looked the same for its entire leveling process, and once again, is another aspect that it feels incomplete. It was stated that more is being added with later features, whatever that means, but as it stands at launch, customization when it comes to cosmetics, armor, and weapons is extremely lacking, and that's a very big fault when it comes to a looter shooter game. That said, there is customization to be done. There's a variety of different colors and materials you can add, which is cool, even vinyls and wear states. So you can abuse that, as that's the only way you can make your Javelin look unique currently. Really quite sad. Now going back to the combat system, on top of just shooting, there's abilities and combos. Now this is where Anthem's combat gets fun, and I think is missed by a lot of people trying it out. Each Javelin has 2 unique abilities and 1 powerful ultimate, along with a support ability. Not only that, those abilities are tied to loot in the same way as your weapons are, so they have a slot of gear. So for an example, on my Javelin, on my Colossus, my Q key can be a rocket, but not only can I get better variants of that through the looting system, I can also get a variant that changes it entirely to now be a firewall or be a lightning coil ability. My E key, the same. What was another rocket-like ability can change to a flamethrower or an acid throwing weapon. So when combining this with your weapons, adds tons of variety to your combat style, especially as you're leveling, as some of those abilities can change how you play entirely, and this is replicated to all the other Javelins. On top of that, there's still components which improve your Javelin. In the case of the Colossus again, it made me tankier, but it can also do things like improving my shield to do 300% more damage. So now my shield key, which traditionally on other Javelins is the dodge key, isn't just a defensive ability anymore. I can now charge onto enemies, killing them almost instantly. Combine this with a flamethrower, and now I want to be constantly close to my enemies for maximum damage. This is further extended by getting components that benefit specific types of damage, so you're gonna be playing around with that in order for you to build your perfect loadout, seeing what synergizes the best and what works the best, especially in the endgame, but I'll leave the endgame talk towards the end. Then there's combos, which adds more variety and some depth to the overall combat. Now, here the game once again did a piss poor job of explaining how it works. Did you know there's triggers and detonators? How specific abilities trigger combos and others actually detonates them? Did you know your Javelin changes the effect of the combo, like how the Colossus combos does an area of effect damage, or how the Storm combos spread the element effect to all enemies nearby? How certain elements are best against one type of enemy? No? Well, the game didn't really explain how all of that work. I only learned through sheer experimentation, which I liked, but the tutorial is absolutely needed to tell people, hey, this is not just about shooting, it's actually about using your abilities in this specific way, as often as possible, to do combos. That's how you do proper damage here. And once you get into that mindset and your team is in perfect sync to create combos, or you have this really nice build in order to trigger them easily and detonate them, like for me on a Colossus, a flamethrower with melee attacks, All of this makes it really fun and engaging, and the sound effects and the visual feedback of each combo is so satisfying and makes combat all the better. Granted, as you probably saw from that, using your abilities a lot, especially the ultimate, basically makes you blind, which is not fun when you're trying to get away from something or while trying to aim. But the problem with the combat, besides the lack of explanation of how it actually works, is, well, where you do it. Enemies have a pretty good variety. Not the best, could be better, but there's a decent enough variety to not make you feel like you're fighting the same enemies over and over again. Most enemies also have weak points that you can take advantage of, especially on bosses, making you aim more carefully and use your abilities more appropriately. This then leads to the sponginess of some enemies. Especially bosses can be a nightmare in that sense, and in general it lacks the excitement of other fights. That said, there are bigger issues, like how legendary enemies, same as the other enemies, but randomly spawned, are tougher. So they have this really weird difficulty spike, not just when it comes to sponginess, but the damage they deal can go from "this is totally cool" to "oh shit, I'm dead" out of nowhere, all due to getting one hit from this legendary mob. So that combines with the fact that it's kinda hard to tell when you're being damaged, made it feel very inconsistent when it comes to damage taken. Another issue is on AI. Generally it works, but there's still various encounters where enemies just stand there and do nothing, which completely breaks the immersion of the game and the engagement you having with the combat. And more inconsistencies when it comes to difficulty. Sometimes you can breeze through the fights and enemies, other times you die extremely quickly, especially in the higher difficulty levels. Now, when it comes to the missions, they just feel extremely repetitive. Like I said, combat does carry it, but if you're not someone that is fine with just the combat being fun, you're gonna get bored very quickly. So the content or modes available besides the main story and side stories to go through is contracts, similar to the side missions, although it's sort of chained. Then strongholds, more dedicated to the endgame content, like these big areas where most loot can be found, and the free play. Now, free play is cool because it allows you to free roam the world with nothing attached. You can just fly anywhere, dive underwater, which is really cool, but what you get out of it, well, unfortunately not much. You can gather materials for crafting, more on that in a bit, do these world events, which is nice. They're just like missions, but you come across them dynamically as you explore, so it felt much more organic than the regular on-the-rails missions, but they can get boring quick as well, since like them they are extremely repetitive, and world bosses, with a few collectibles here or there. There's also something called Shaper Storms, which apparently can spawn tons of enemies for players to kill or warp us to an entirely new planet, which sounds awesome, but I believe they're only going to appear starting at Act 1, which is going to come in the 1st of March. So free play is a cool addition overall, but it just feels incomplete and poorly thought out. Well, for one, you matchmake with about 6 people, and there's no way to communicate. So if you're not with friends and want to take on a world boss or a world event, you either face it alone, good luck, as there's no difficulty scaling regarding how many freelancers are present during the fight, or wait there till someone appears. There's no markers or indications whatsoever on the map letting people know in your matchmaking group that there is a world event going on or a boss fight. There's still an issue of disappearing enemies throughout the world as well, so many issues, but a pretty good foundation if those issues and bugs get ironed out and fixed. It's a great mode to just wander in for a while and get some loot, as each world event rewards you with a nice little chest. Strongholds in turn is more focused for endgame. They are big expeditions or missions with various objectives and goals. This is where I had the most fun, and it's where the game feels like a pure looter shooter. Tons of enemies to kill, tons of loot rewarding you for your efforts, and a big boss. Loot in general here weirdly isn't given in real time. You limit yourself by picking up items for various rarities, which as your level increases in chances, but when you pick it up, you don't get that real satisfaction because you only found out what you got at the end of the mission on the victory screen, and this works for every single mode, which doesn't give you as a good enough rewarding feeling as it could have. It's still great, not gonna deny that, getting colorful loot is fun, but on top of that, there's the issue that if you leave a mission or the server goes down or your power goes out or your internet goes out, you lose everything, all of your progress, as your actions aren't saved until the end of said mission on that victory screen, which is honestly such a dumb system. There's yet another big issue that is shared throughout all the content available, and is the loading screens. Jesus Christ. So loadings became a bit of a meme of how long they can get and how frequent they are. And yes, the Day 1 patch has improved them, but here's the order of the loadings you can get. Not always like this, but possible in the game. First, loading into the game. Okay, cool, bit long, but fine. Get to the forge and want to change your loadout, loading screen. This is the only time you can do it, by the way. You cannot change your gear out in the world. Want to get into a mission, loading screen. The biggest of them, I might add. Then inside that one mission, you can get another loading screen if you go into a cave. Then if you die and you wish to respawn, another loading screen. Stray even an inch away from the objective and squad, another loading screen. Like honestly, the tethering system needs a proper fix. It can be infuriating and game breaking, extremely aggressive, and this example actually happened to me back to back. It just made me laugh out loud. And then once all of that is done, another loading screen back to the base to go on another mission. So yeah, all of this does pull you out of the game. I just had my second screen or laptop to distract myself from it anytime it happened. In fact, a lot of this review was written in between loading screens. I'm having one right now. How's that for fourth wall breaking? Now, I want to talk more about loot and in turn the endgame, as it's inherently connected, but I also want to touch on many other issues the game has. So there's a couple of other systems in the game which gives you objectives, challenges, trials, and reputation. Challenges get a bit importance at the endgame after finishing the main story. It actually gives these goals for you to chase for some nice rewards. Think of them as achievements that give stuff. Trials are these daily, weekly, and monthly goals that can also give rewards by meeting certain criteria and objectives. But then there's also alliance status, which depending on what you do in a week, it gives you coin based on how many friends you played with, and they can also give you extra coin. But if you play with randoms, they can give you also. A bit convoluted, to say the least, but is something that progresses naturally really as you play, just like the challenges. The 3 reputations present again is something that you gain in almost every activity, but it also just happens as you play. But like the trials and alliance status, there's really no proper explanation of how it works, and its rewards can be often ambiguous. There's so many of this tracking systems that feels a bit too much and again convoluted. I just limited myself by playing the game, and rewards came like coins, but a lot of that came from these background systems that I still don't understand fully. Then there's performance. Much better now from the demo, but still not acceptable. With a 2080, it's still impossible to play the game at 4K even at low settings. It just cannot maintain 60 FPS. Constant drops whenever there's big fights, but even dropping to 1440p, there's still constant and weird dips to a 30 FPS regularly, like for no reason whatsoever, like nothing is happening on the screen and yet it's dropping to 30 FPS. Maybe it's my system, but something is really off about performance. The menus, specifically on the expedition mission map, are better now, but geez, they were really not designed for mouse and keyboard. Loads of hold key to perform action, mouse overs, and weirdly it requires you to use escape a lot to manage the pages, and not to say weird and out of nowhere keybinds like using Q and E to navigate the consumables and the missions pages. There's also tons of technical issues like sound cutting out of nowhere requiring a restart, or crashes with no error messages, or missions bugging out, no FOV slider. Again, Day 1 patch fixed some of those, but some are still present. Now, The endgame. So the level cap here is 30. The main story missions does not get you there, by the way. You're gonna need to do some side stuff or some other grinds to get it, but once you do is when the real grind begins. And because of what I'm about to say, I would advise anyone looking to play the game, do not rush towards the end. Basically, the goal is to get better and better gear, called Masterwork or Legendaries. How you gonna do that? Well, by playing the harder difficulties in any of the content available. So it's gonna be the same recycled strongholds, free play, or going on contracts, which are daily, much tougher now, or going to quick play, replaying any past mission randomly. Up to this point, I always played the game on hard, and the difficulty, when it worked, was fairly good. Wasn't too spongy and wasn't too unfair, but to get a higher chance on those Masterwork gear, you need to play the Grandmaster difficulty, 1, 2, 3, each being more difficult and requiring you to have better and better gear and builds, as in Javelin power, which is the only stat you get about your character. There is no actual stat page whatsoever in a looter shooter. Why? Who knows? Anyway, getting Masterwork gear is satisfying, not gonna lie. There's this really cool effect when you get it, and weapons actually do change a bit now, aesthetically. Still mostly a recolor, but at least look like they are special. Not only that, Masterwork gear has special stats or effects, making them even more powerful in comparison to, say, epic gear. Firing this assault rifle increases my elemental damage and stacks up, or killing enemies with my flamethrower increases its damage, or a pistol that does far more damage as long as I'm in the air. So it's extra things to play around with your build, loadout, and even gameplay, and that's really fun. Legendaries work like that, but it's only weapons, I believe, but just more powerful than Masterwork gear. But here's the problem. There's also inscriptions, or these passive stats on every piece of gear, 4 of them, and they are completely randomized, and they can range from increasing weapon damage, ammo magazines, to increasing harvest chance when gathering. Not really in the same playing field, right? So in the beginning, when you add a Grandmaster 1, getting a Masterwork is satisfying, because they're so powerful and you're trying to replace your epics and you feel ever more powerful in turn. But after that, when you're trying to min-max your character, it just becomes really frustrating, because even if you really get this really cool Masterwork gear, your favorite piece, say a component or a weapon, you can still get shit inscriptions with a vast difference in power, which completely demotivates you to keep on grinding. And not only that, some of these are so confusing on what they do, and again, the game doesn't really explain them. So, can you reroll the stats at least? Well, sort of. This is where the crafting system comes in. While leveling is practically useless and pointless, as you're constantly changing gear as you get more levels, but you can craft Masterwork gear. However, to craft it, you need to get the item in the first place, and then you need to complete a set challenge to get the blueprint. So only after that is when you can craft it by using materials you get when salvaging gear or the materials around the world, in particularly these embers. But still, it's just RNG and another repetitive process on top of the grind until you finally get something worthwhile. And that's another thing. The game isn't very clear and straightforward on where to get the blueprints to craft the items. You have to navigate multiple pages in your challenge menu in order to find them. Then there's more issues, which is content, or well, lack of it. There's only 3 strongholds available, and the missions you can do, even on free play currently, are so repetitive that after a while, at least for me, just becomes a chore. It's all the same as you did while leveling. Running, flying from point A to point B, over and over again. Add to that the fact that grinding for gear can get frustrating due to itemization. After a while, it just gets boring. Another issue is the difficulty spike. Grandmaster enemies hit hard and have huge health pools. If you're not into spongy enemies like myself, just don't even try it. And yes, using and abusing the combo mechanics are key in these modes, which is great, rewards good gameplay. Even abusing certain elements like acid so you can deal more damage to them, or freezing them. But so many mechanics on bosses or those legendary enemies that I talked about earlier practically one-shot you, especially those nasty titans, which at points just becomes frustrating. Overall, nothing changes. No new mechanics, just more damage taken and bigger HP pools after each Grandmaster, which does change a little bit how you play the game. But personally, I don't find that to be engaging gameplay, but I can understand it's part of the genre. One inconsistency I did notice, however, Tyrant Mine is far easier stronghold to get on than say Heart of Rage. He's not even on the same league, even at technically the same level of difficulty. And it shows even more how boss fights are simply not very well designed for the game. You come from these high action and movement fights to boss fights where you have to hide behind cover and be super careful not to die, which is fine because against the rest of the game's design and gameplay, and when you're not that super powerful yet or have a squad which is crap at making combos because the game didn't really explain them in the first place, the boss fights can drag on a lot, upwards to 10 minutes or more, which makes it a boring fight to get through. This is also when consumables get a bit more meaningful. One-time use items you can equip and craft before an expedition, increasing things like your shield power, combo damage, and etc. A good place to dump a lot of crafting embers that you got over the course of playing the game, or from salvaging all the useless gear. But in general, as of now, endgame content doesn't feel all that fun to play. Gear can be fun to mess around with and create interesting builds, but there's a lot of frustration when trying to min-max your character, and just a lot of repetitive semi-content, again, at least for now. And to add to all of this, I completely forgot, the game had a character creation system with male and female options, but it was so lacking that, well, I even forgot to mention it. So all in all, you can find some fun with the game, but it's not plain and simply a Bioware game. I had fun at times. I loved the combats before the endgame bullet sponge. Messing around with my loadout was also fun, getting items and all of that. The world was fun to navigate and even my javelin was cool, but in the end it's still not a Bioware game. If you do want a looter shooter to sink a lot of time into, wait a couple of months and see what happens. As of right now, isn't that worth it. But there's good foundations. It just seems is yet another one of those AAA titles that comes out incomplete, that went through a rough development cycle. I mean, we look at the first official trailer to the now released product, it's like a different game altogether. I want to play that. Add to that the possibility of being forced by EA to become a game as a service instead of an actual game. It simply left very little room for Anthem to actually breathe and flourish. When it comes to being a looter shooter, it can be salvaged and improved. Let's just hope Bioware is able to come back from this and EA doesn't pull the plug. It does make me sad that the game turned out this way. EA pulling reviews from fellow content creators, I mean, I had zero expectations, but yet I feel disappointed. I still want to see a Dragon Age 4 though. Alright guys, that does it for me for today. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again soon.